Okay, everybody, welcome here to this session, Going Digital. I'm David Levy, I'm Director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'm really pleased to see all of you here this morning. I should say that there's lots of sessions at this in Perugia which are about what other people should do, about what platforms should do, what the audience should do, what other tech companies should do. This one is really about what the news industry itself should do, and so in that sense it's a kind of tough start as the first session on Friday morning. Lucy Kueng was the Google Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Reuters Institute last year and did this report for us, which she's going to talk about in a minute, Going Digital. Lucy's a really unusual person who combines academic rigor with industry relevance in the research that she does. That's the kind of sweet spot that we at the Reuters Institute try and focus on. And Lucy's report is a kind of exemplary case of doing that. So in a minute, Lucy will introduce her findings for about 15 minutes. And here we have Renee Kaplan, Head of Audience Engagement from the FT, and Inga Thora, who is Executive Editor, CNN Digital International. And they were both interviewed by Lucy for this report, and they're both going to kind of respond with some of their thoughts after Lucy's finished. So the running order is introduction from Lucy with some slides, about 15 minutes, then a response from Renee, response from Inga, brief discussion here, then we throw it to questions to you. And I would try and organize the time so each of our panelists has time for a 30-second wrap-up point at the end, but that depends on how lively the question and answer session is. So, okay, I'm going to hand over to Lucy, and if we could bring up the slide on the screen, then Lucy can start.
Yeah.
There we are.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah. So, good morning, everyone. I hope you're all in good shape. I think we're all a bit kind of exhausted, so I'm going to try and make this light and give kind of top-level findings, and then, where possible, kind of move on to Renee and Inga and David to give kind of, because they're really doing this. I mean, I'm talking about it, they're doing it, and so bring in their experiences as well. So this was a piece of research I did last year for the Reuters Institute, and it really had one core premise, that there's two transformations happening, actually. One is there's a lot of focus on, that's the content transformation, but the other one is the organizations are transforming very fast. And I think that's getting too little attention, because actually if that doesn't happen well, then the content transformation doesn't bring the fruit it should. And it's a really, really difficult, complex transformation that has to happen inside organizations. So the kind of provocative thesis I had behind this was media companies that are not really in organizations that have ever really prized managing themselves well, running themselves well as businesses, really have to start putting a huge amount of emphasis on transforming their organizations as well as their product. And then I started to think, okay, well, what does best practice look like? Who is doing this well? And success is really, really difficult to define for legacy media right now. Their environment is so tough. But I kind of picked on a handful of companies who seem to be pulling ahead of the pack. They're not universally fantastic in every dimension, but a lot of them are really, I think, have a lot to teach all of us in terms of how they approach things. So the companies I looked at, these are the ones I went into a lot of depth. So Axel Springer, Economist, FT, New York Times, Schibsted, Washington Post, Vox. And that meant I wrote a kind of really long, detailed case study, and then I went and did between 10 and 20 interviews inside the company. And then I did other companies where, obviously with the research resources are stretched, I could have done huge amounts of companies, but these, the smaller blue bubble of companies, I looked at specific things they were doing really, really well. So what did I find? I think we have to start, in the last 10, 15 years since the internet hit, we've got very seduced by tech and very seduced by Silicon Valley. And a lot of our approaches to how we should change our organizations have been very influenced by a set of premises that are really about software-based young organizations with a lot of investment capital. And those are organizations that are relatively new, relatively straightforward, have one goal of exponential growth, focus all their energies on that, and will change and change and change until they meet that growth and get the returns their investors want. Now, legacy media are now competing against that set, but are a really different set of organizations. So I guess one of my premises is there are some great techniques in there, agile, scrum, design thinking, but they're not going to solve the whole organizational challenge. They're good for parts of the challenge, but legacy media organizations are fantastically complicated entities. And that's because they started off with a kind of single one product for everyone, relatively simple. And then sort of in the 1980s, a lot of older companies then added a niche layer thanks to technology. So they added on print supplements, they added niche channels. 1995 onwards, they add their digital online layers. So the business is getting more and more complex. And then recently, 2008 onwards, they kind of added the social mobile layer. So you have companies with 4 different distinct layers in them. And the people running them, making decisions, are trying to spread investments and decisions across all of these layers. And they're trying to make sure all these layers work together. And some of the companies we're competing against are just at the top 2 layers. They've got much more simple environments and tasks in which to work in, and they've often got a lot more money, because the other story happening here is legacy media is getting progressively poorer as for anyone advertising finance, as advertising moves online, we all know we get a smaller share of that pie. So for many legacy organizations, a whole leg of their business model has been kicked away. So I think we have to recognize that complexity when we look at how media organizations need to change. So huge benefits for audiences, fantastic increase in choice in what they consume and how and where. But legacy media organizations are starting from a point of extreme complexity. And that's why one of the side elements that came out of this is it's really important to be disciplined about getting rid of things that are no longer core and no longer necessary. If you talk to most people in a media organization, everyone knows a business or a unit or a product that actually everyone knows has had its day. And it's really important to think about exiting to free resources for this growth. So essentially the big problem, this slide is really the whole story. Historic strengths and weaknesses and assets are in the bottom 2 layers, and the whole story is the future is in the top 2 layers, and trying to move the center of gravity up. And that brings all kinds of cultural challenges and product challenges and so on. And the other big issue is simply legacy media. A lot of the mass media players grew up being the killer players in their market, and they no longer are. You know, the legacy media are now competing against the 5 biggest organizations on the planet. So even if they're large in their domestic markets, they are massively overshadowed by their new competitors. And they're competing against them for audience attention. They're competing against them in terms of user experience. Very, very difficult. And it's a kind of, you know, to use Brexit terminology, a reduction in sovereignty. We've lost control, complete control over the context in which our content is consumed. We have much weaker relationships with audiences. We know less about what they're doing, and other people know more. So it's a kind of depressing picture, but I think it's really important people understand the challenge is enormous, actually, for legacy media. And once you kind of step out of the bubble and see the nature of the challenge, you begin to get a kind of sense of urgency about transforming. I'm going to focus on this quite a bit on how to approach this issue of, you know, the top-line strategy. And when I talk to people about what strategy's been like the last 10, 15 years, they all said, yes, we've had a strategy, but in practice, it's been completely hijacked by shiny new things, short-term panics, changes in platform philosophy. So there's been a huge difficulty in terms of holding on to a steady course through all of this development. And that is very, very competitively worrying, because the new competitors, although they look kind of sharp and nimble and modern, and they have fantastic kitchens and lots of young people working there, in fact, they're following really old-fashioned industrial economic competitive strategies, lock in audiences, build up barriers to entry, build moats around the business. So they are actually following really, really long-term strategies. And meanwhile, a lot of legacy media are moving and not being very consistent in terms of what they're trying to do. So what should they be trying to do? What was really clear in the stronger organizations I talked to is how rigorous they are actually with strategy. They've managed to cut through this very febrile, stressy environment. And there's kind of 4 common elements. The first one is a very, very clear sense of what on earth this organization is meant to do. And that's really often just correlates to the long-established journalistic goals, why that organization existed. What, you know, in Clayton Christensen terms, what job are we doing for our readers? The bottom bit, which has actually become the toughest challenge, and this is where actually the agility is really happening, I think, is in the revenue models. And what we're seeing in revenue, as a lot of you will be finding, is this shift from being advertising financed to being reader financed, but that's never going to be enough. So this adding more and more options into this bottom layer. But real clarity about what they're trying to do in terms of providing benefit value for their readers, improving their readers' lives, their audience's lives, and at the bottom, a really clear sense of what they're trying to do with revenues, what the options are, how far that can take them. And those two elements then kind of function as a cage almost, in which they assess all of these shiny new things that we've been dealing with. And the shiny new thing problem is a real problem, but what really seems to separate the stronger from the weaker is they have a very rigorous way of looking at the shiny new things. And it can be it's going to deliver revenue, it's going to help us deliver what we're trying to do for audiences, or it can be something that Washington Post said to me, yeah, this is a kind of stupid thing to get involved in, but we had a team of really, really smart developers, and we knew we wouldn't be able to hang on to them unless we had some really, really challenging engineering projects. But what I'm talking about is complete clarity, intentionality. We are engaging in Snapchat because of this. And that's, I think, that's that clarity of thinking that marks the stronger from the weakers. And then and the back of that, what's really, the big story in the media has been the ascendancy of technology and data. And what we're seeing is it's becoming the kind of central nervous system of these organizations. It's not possible to get the journalism right for the audiences if the data isn't good, if the tech isn't good. It's not possible to build the kind of relationship with audiences and members and subscribers if the tech isn't good. And also an understanding, it's a difficult understanding, but the whole organization really gets the importance of tech and is, prepared to work with that and engage with that, however difficult and off-putting it may be. Before I started on the actual research, I did about 20 interviews saying, what do you really want to know? And the two things they wanted help on was actually agility, pivoting at that point. Everyone was talking about pivoting, and the other was culture. And we talked about culture yesterday, so I'm going to leave that out here. But this issue of pivoting is a real Silicon Valley import. And it's really clear that legacy organizations, all these layers, all this complexity, legacy products, legacy audience, as well as new ones, can't pivot the way a LinkedIn or a Facebook or a Snapchat can. But they can actually and do pull off quite big shifts. And in order for those shifts to happen, you need to have a few pieces in place beforehand. It's a bit like a fire drill in a primary school. You can't practice it when the fire's on. You need to have it ready. You need to have the organization ready to move. And the three elements are, if you have this kind of big push in the environment, the three things that need to be there are firstly, very clear signaling from the leader, from the leadership, we are doing this, and it needs to be coherent with the messages you've already had. So this is our goal. Because of this has happened, we're going to have to go a different way, but we're still hanging on to the goal. Cultural acceptance. What was very clear, the companies I talked to, but particularly in the newer ones like Vox and Mike, they really hire for people who are quite flexible. They hire for people with great backgrounds, great track records, but also people who they sense will not be completely wrong-footed if their job is changed, if they have to do something else. And what we're seeing also is quite a lot of kind of structural flexibility. So a lot of using multidisciplinary project teams to pull off big strategic shifts, and a lot of use of internships, a lot of use of job swaps. In terms of how and where tech, business, and journalism are emerging, this is kind of the big story. I was really curious to know how are these coming together. And essentially, there seem to be four areas where they're coming together. The first is digital storytelling, which is a kind of no-brainer. The second is data, and we've got the expert in data, integration of data with journalism activities here, and social media product. One of the things that seems another sort of indicator for how strong companies are likely to be is the extent to which product is understood. Product is a really complicated area. It's come from nowhere. It's now kind of up at board level. It's a really, really important way to get digital products out to the markets. And what's interesting is some companies, product people are really having a fight. Their role is not understood. Others, it really is. But what we have here is a kind of ladder of engagement where these three elements work together to up the journalism, but also get lift in revenues. So, you know, social media is used as a way to get stories in front of more people, data is a way to make sure the right stories are reaching the right people, and then digital storytelling to deepen engagement. And then different kind of constellations of newsroom structures are appearing on top of these four key elements. And in the middle of this, there's a very interesting and I think optimistic change happening in the role of journalists that's kind of leveraging off these, you know, the ascendancy of tech and the new imperatives in the industry. And this isn't happening to all journalists, but you do see it happening with people like leading journalists in publications. And I think it's a really, really interesting development. So this would be people like David Farenthold at the Washington Post, or Sarah Clift at Vox, or Brian Stelter at CNN, and there are obviously many candidates for this. But essentially, you get journalists who are given autonomy of a particular field, and it can be quite a geeky field, like healthcare policy in the US, and they develop this expertise, they take ownership of this field, and they build it out through the Twitter feed, through a conversational podcast, conversational newsletter event. So they get Kara Swisher at Recode is also a classic example of this. They become to own an area, and they build a much deeper, more intense relationship with audiences through these kind of flanking areas. And those there's a complete shift in the nature of the audiences. The audiences become incredibly loyal to these journalists. So Vox were telling me that, you know, to the bemusement of journalists, they're beginning to get wedding invitations from some of the podcast listeners. They really think these people are friends, they know them. And that is actually a fantastic basis. It builds loyalty, it builds engagement, it's a very high quality relationship, and it's really the heart of kind of sustainability. So this is a kind of virtuous circle that I'm beginning to see lifting in a number of these organizations, and I think it's only positive, and I think it's really good news for the journalists as well. In terms of culture change, I talked about that yesterday. The real message there is culture change happens not by attacking it head on, by attacking it indirectly, but very intentionally. So it's about leadership, it's about continuous ongoing learning inside the organization, and these kind of people issues around multidisciplinary teams, embedding, and flexible staff. I'm running out of time, I'm not going too much into that, but we talked a lot about that in the panel yesterday, and I think there's a stream on that. So just to close, a bit idiosyncratically, the four things that really hit me after finishing this research are, firstly, we've talked so much in the industry about innovation. There have been so many conferences on innovation, and innovation is absolutely critical. We have to innovate. We have to invent new products and services, but innovation is not strategy. If we're innovating a lot, we can't do that at the expense of being really smart and trying to work out how on earth do we find a viable future for journalism in a very, very unwelcome environment. So my big plead is do some really hard strategic thinking. And it's not easy and it's not nice, but you really have to get rigorous, and it will change. But this kind of rigor in terms of thinking through what you're doing is absolutely central. Secondly, digital storytelling is really fun. Data is really seductive, but transforming organizations is a grind. And I've been really struck by the degree of burnout in the very, very smart people I've been talking to, especially people who are either driving these change processes through or on the boundaries of old and new. And I think it's a kind of hidden issue, but I think it's a horrible experience for the people experiencing it, and I think it's very, very dangerous for the organizations because these key individuals are being pushed to the limit of what they can do. And I think that's something I personally want to look at in more depth. Third thing, the big surprise to me is how central HR is. You know, HR is an issue that makes eyeballs roll and lips curl, and no one wants to go there, and everyone thinks it's just about the plumbing, it's just about compensation and benefits. It's really, really important, making sure you can get the right expertise into your organization when you need it, making sure you can move people around. And I think that's where legacy media is leaving the biggest opportunity on the table. There's the biggest opportunity for a fast uptick in performance by putting more energy into people. And that you see actually a huge difference between Silicon Valley tech, new players, and old players. The new Silicon Valley companies are so smart on HR. And lastly, I think what makes this really hard is everyone is doing most of it. A lot of people have even won awards for bits of this. But what you see God is really in the details. God is in the caliber of the execution. You know, the caliber and the way in which you've really integrated data into journalism, into the kind of business models, for example, and the extent to which all of these elements work together. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you very much. And just to say, the report, you can find the report on the Reuters Institute website if you want it. So, Renee, how does this resonate with you? And are you one of those shiny new things, or in terms of your role of audience engagement and data at the FT? So, what do you make of this?
Sure. A couple things. First of all, the report really is excellent because I think it sums up, and here's the secret to the report. Not only is it very thorough and a little bit long, but Lucy has put key points at the bottom of every chapter that essentially give you a roadmap to things that I can do. So it really gets at the heart of what legacy newsrooms all over the place are doing. And so it just has great lessons for whatever status or state or you know, whatever your newsroom or whatever organization you're in, it actually is very helpful. Precisely because one of the other elements you just mentioned now, I think, is absolutely at the heart of what makes innovation and change complicated, and that is the extreme complexity of legacy newsrooms. You know, as it happens, the Financial Times is 100 and many some odd years old. It is really old. CNN is not quite as old, but it's incredibly complex. And you know, when you're trying to figure out what the future looks like and how to change how to change the newsroom to get ready for the future, it's the extreme complexity which is the most challenging, because the question is, where do we start? By what piece do we grab this? What do we need to do first? So, I mean, a couple of points, 5 to be precise, that I'll sort of throw out, not any particular order, but that kind of respond to some of the points that Lucy is making in her report. The first thing is I found that for the most part, newsrooms aren't necessarily resistant to change. They're just scared of what change looks like, or they're scared to say that they don't know what to do or how to do it. So people actually do want to be prepared for the future. They want their jobs to last. They want to know that the media and the newsroom they're working in is going to be something that's not only viable, but you know, as competitive in the future. And so it's not so much not wanting to change, but it's how do we do it? They actually kind of want to be told how to do it. And so it really is a question of understanding how to be reassuring and how to paint a vision of what the future looks like that is relevant to people in the newsroom. That's the first point. How do you basically tell people in a newsroom at every level what's in it for them about changing? Why should you be interested in innovating? It ultimately comes down to a very human, narcissistic thing. What's in it for me? And so a lot of the strategy of change is understanding and translating how there is self-interest in every level of the organization in changing. But then, actually, the second point and one of the points that Lucy's making, innovation for the sake of innovation, it goes nowhere. You know, transformation and innovating it sounds great, especially in the kind of tech-friendly world we live in, where being in the innovation space is kind of cool. It doesn't mean anything, and especially means nothing in legacy newsrooms. And so the absolute priority, in my experience, has been figuring out, first of all, what is the business goal of the organization I'm in? And it's not something journalists like to talk about, but for better or for worse, and I think at this point we've gotten to the space or the place where journalists are comfortable with this, everyone knows that we're only as good as our business model. Otherwise, there is no work and there is no newsroom. So the second thing that I found really important is, let's try to clarify for the newsroom what exactly is the business goal of my organization. For the most part, they know, but kind of, not always. And what is the business goal? Okay, and how does that translate into editorial strategy? You know, we know what the business objective is when it comes to the Financial Times. It's subscriptions. It's converting people to being paid users and keeping them. Okay, that's the business goal. How does that translate editorially? What is the editorial strategy version of the business strategy? And once you've answered that question, that essentially needs to be, when people wonder, well, why are we on Snapchat? Or why do I have to produce elements for social media? Or why do I need to publish my story at this time instead of that time? Why do I need to care about social referral traffic or search referral traffic? Why do I need to do all these things? The answer to the why always has to be because it helps us get to this business goal. And this is the editorial means to get to that business goal. The third point is understanding the limitations of a newsroom. Yes, okay, we know that people, change is scary. Explain to them and clarify to them how to change and why change is actually in their interest. Make the editorial strategy something that they can actually do, and then understand the limitations. Every newsroom is very different. Certain things will work in some newsrooms, certain things won't. And there's a lot of cultural translation that is an important part of managing change, which is also being aware of, well, you know what, we're not going to do this because we're not ready. The culture in the newsroom is not, maybe tomorrow, maybe 6 months down the road, maybe a year down the road, but today, we're not there yet. Having modest, achievable goals that will actually deliver success is absolutely fundamental, because if you don't deliver some kind of success that's an internal success, something that people in the newsroom feel like we did. Oh, right, so we created this. I'll give an example. We created a schedule for publication in the newsroom in the FT that was very simple. We were publishing most of our content towards the end of the day. That was the traditional print deadline for a newspaper. You have to get everything filed by 5 p.m., everything to the printer by 7 p.m., so the paper can come out the next day. Except that in the digital age, and the bulk of our audience was coming mostly in the morning. And if you're publishing all your content at the end of the day, and most of your audience is coming in the morning, there's a disjuncture. The content won't be fresh, it won't rank in Google, it won't get the page views it deserves. So we created a broadcast schedule, is what we called it, where we tried to create a schedule of publication that was more aligned with when readers were reading. Well, it is a dramatic cultural shift when you spent your whole career filing for 5 p.m., when you're suddenly told that actually that has to be ready for 5 a.m. publication. But that's a concrete example of if you can show with the data, actually, if you publish at this time, you'll get X% more page views, and the people who then clicked on your story, because they came and found stories that were fresh and just published at the time they were reading, then went on to read more stories, you've demonstrated concretely with an actual measurable impact why it is that the thing that they didn't want to do, which was file early in the morning, is not only relevant to them, but gets them what they want, which is more readers. Which brings me to, I think I'm on my fourth point. Final point. You are only as good in managing change and bringing about innovation as you can measure the impact of it and demonstrate it back to the newsroom. And that's where data is absolutely fundamental. Data sounds very complex to a newsroom, but data is very simply, I'm going to help you measure the impact of what you do and help show you that the things that I'm asking you to do are relevant and measurably useful in making this a sustainable business and making you have a job tomorrow.
Renee, thank you very much. Inga, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's in many ways a sort of an interesting panel because even though Renee and I come from legacy organizations, they're very, very different. I mean, first of all, print is as we've talked about, like it's in its sort of dying days. TV is very strong and it's still pulling in a lot of ad money. So, our legacy sort of part of the business is incredibly strong still. So it's kind of how do you make a change in a business where the original part of it is still incredibly dominant, both for revenue reasons and for audience reasons. So you're building on sort of top of that. The other difference, I guess, between us is that CNN is still a business of scale. We're very much out there. We don't have subscription. Everything's free, so we're very much in that world. So how do you kind of change within that sort of system? Now, I spent 15 years at the BBC, so I had that experience of trying to churn a little bit, and those of you who would have been at the panel yesterday would have heard Fiona talk about how she's trying to sort of embed digital into these sort of different areas. Now, I had the luxury at CNN when I started of being the first hire in a massive investment from Turner into CNN Digital. They pumped $20 million into CNN Digital, and I was basically given a free hand to create an international digital structure within a legacy organization. It was an incredibly exciting challenge for me, and I was given absolute carte blanche in who I wanted to hire, what kind of people I needed. So I basically sat down and I thought, I know TV very well. I started my business there. I've been in digital for quite a while, so how do I do this? I did my triangle of where my skill set were lacking and thought, well, these are the people I need to hire in. I need to hire in the people who are going to bring knowledge that doesn't exist in the organization, and I don't have myself as well. So I hired in a lot of digitally native people. I hired in incredibly smart editors who came from, again, from very different, one from a sort of a legacy organization, which was The Guardian, and another one from a very digitally native organization, which was Mashable. And I knew I was taking a risk about how these things would mash, but I was lucky, and these people have been phenomenal. And because I hired good people, they hired good people below them. But most of these people had no TV experience whatsoever. And I was bringing them into a company that thought in television all the time. But we went from 4 people sitting in a sort of a back office to around 75 strong sitting right at the front of the office. So the changes in the CNN bureau in London was phenomenal. And certainly the TV people sort of start seeing that this is a growing thing. It's a priority area for the business. And they started kind of getting a little bit more curious about what we were doing. I think we also brought in a very different rigor into the organization. We started saying, well, we're not going to talk about logistics or where you're going to put your satellite trucks or where you're going to, where your, IBF is going to come from or whatever it is. We're going to talk about the story. It has to be a story-first approach for us to get to where we need to do on digital storytelling. And I think that, that was, although, I really don't want to talk down my television journalism, it's a very different way of thinking. We need that headline to go out there for it to make a difference. We need the story to be different from the vast noise that is on the internet. Our competition is absolutely fierce compared to the television competition where, you might be talking about 2, maximum 3 channels internationally. You're talking a plethora, multitude of things. So it kind of did change. It was the physical presence of digital right there in the newsroom. And then there was this sort of different way of thinking around our news gathering. So I really want to say maybe the 3 kind of key things, the results that came from this, and I really, really want to stress that this is still a work in progress. We have not been able to turn CNN around in 2 years, but we are working on it. So I think that I want to say, first of all, is that the processes have definitely changed. To start off with, we used to have 2 morning meetings. One of them was digital and one of them was television. We sort of, there was some cross-section of people that attended both. Now we have 1 meeting every morning, 8:30, led by our director, the digital director for EMEA, who runs the whole meeting for the whole area, including television, digital, whatever it is, sets the priorities, and everyone sort of chimes in. So it becomes a very much sort of story first, distribution second. The other one is sort of the progress towards bringing digital to an equal platform to television. This is still obviously a very much an ongoing thing. But whereas before digital used to kind of, news gathering used to go out, gather the story, and then bring us sort of like, well, here are some things, do something digital with it, and you can fix this. We are now part of the conversation from the beginning, before they go out, before they go there, we will say to them, you need to bring me back that headline, I need that story, I need you to gather this, I need you to spell the names correctly, I need you to find out how old they are, all those things that TV doesn't need, but is probably ingrained in print journalism. We had to teach our television colleagues that these things matter in print. So that was one thing. And so we're getting into the conversation early. We're being part of the conversation. And then the third thing I probably want to mention is that we have also brought, metrics not to the same granular level as FT, but for a TV journalist, where it was interesting to me listening to Christina yesterday where she said their anchor wasn't recognized in Sweden. If they see progress, if they see their names out there, their bylines, they can see that people are reading it, and I can literally show them, look, there were 3 million people that read your story yesterday. There is nothing more motivating for these people to keep going and keep going. So I think that, this was a luxury situation that I was in, and I know not many organizations have this injection of cash that we had that allowed us to do this. But it has allowed London to become a real sort of center of integration for CNN, and the same thing is happening sort of in Hong Kong. And that culture is definitely spreading, being noticed, being understood by the rest of the organization. So we're hopeful that bit by bit, this will start to move the dial a little bit.
Okay,
Thank you very much. And just, Inga, just one question to you. One of the things that's sort of emerged in this is about how you lead change. Where does credibility come from in leading culture change, in your experience?
Well, I mean, I think, any journalist will recognize that we have, what we value more than anything else is a very, very strong editorial judgment. So I think that, you have to have, as a leader, you have to have clarity of vision in your editorial judgment and where you want to take stories and where you want to take your team. And I think the second thing is that, what we need also is a recognition as leaders that our roles have changed massively. It's not enough for me just to sit in the morning meeting and say, well, I think we should do Syria, and then we should be doing Ukraine, and then we should be doing this, and that's me kind of done. I then have to sit there and make sure that I am pushing obstacles out of their way, that they know that they have that ability. I have to be incredibly comfortable with the fact that most of my team is more skilled than I am in digital storytelling. I can give them sort of editorial guidance and sit there with my judgment, but I also have to become incredibly comfortable by saying, do you know what, guys, I trust you. I'll empower you to do this because that's why I hired you. I hired you with these skills, and I don't feel that that diminishes me as a leader or that I have to be the master of everything. My job is basically to show that leadership, to give them the room and push the boulders out of the way for them when they're in the way. So I think the credibility comes from you having that confidence in yourself, in their ability, and also having a strong editorial judgment and vision of where you want to take the team.
Okay, thank you. Similar question to Renee. Does your credibility come from the data at your fingertips, or does it matter that you can say, I have worked as a journalist as well, I'm not just a data person?
Good question, and those are two, I think, of the three, I would say, key elements to credibility. It is three elements. The first is, it is having been a journalist, and newsrooms are places of great expertise, and the quality of a newsroom is as good and as expert as its journalists are. And there needs to be a sense within an organization that you understand the core thing that they're doing, that you are speaking their language. The second thing is we often talk about change. I don't know how you feel about this at CNN. We often talk about change needing to come from the bottom up, but to be honest, unless change is sanctioned and encouraged and financed from the top down, it won't happen either. And the third thing is improving results and in measuring the fact that actually the thing that I'm asking you to do, which you don't want to do because it's kind of painful and you don't feel comfortable, is measurably actually interesting and relevant and useful. So it's a combination of the three, I think.
David, I can give an example of exactly what you just said
quick
there
one,
very quickly.
yeah.
We have a correspondent that was very reluctant to kind of write for us. We knew he had the ability. He wrote a story for us. He's very well known in the industry. He's been in it for a long time. We had it edited by a 29-year-old, and he was really not happy with what we did. He called me up, and I had to hold the phone right over here, and he was seriously unhappy. But I talked him around. Took 12 hours, but we got there in the end. And he eventually went along with us. The story was the highest hitting and the highest engagement on the site. So I went back to him saying, look, we do this because we know where our audience is. And here's the metrics to prove that it did that. He sent me a message back saying, looks like I have to get a little bit less precious. And I said, probably. And he is now one of our top performers on digital. So, it can be done.
All right, thank you. Great story. Thanks to all of the panelists up here. I just want to get some questions from some of you. There's one in the front here, and can I see who the next one is going to be after that? In the middle there. So we'll start here. If you could are we trying to get a microphone here, or are we working without a microphone? Yeah, a microphone in the front row here, please. Thank you. Hi.
Thanks for a great panel. So this question, Lucy, you touched on in the beginning, talking about things that organizations have had to let go of, the things that are kind of old. And then Renee, you mentioned it as well. So I'm wondering also, actually with the three ladies, what are some concrete things that you determined that you had to let go of? And of course, when you're trying to do that in a big organization, you're going to have pains with that. How did you overcome the obstacles to doing away with the stuff that's not performing to allow you to refocus your efforts on growth?
Okay, let's get two concrete examples from Inga and then Renee, and I may ask Lucy to come back and sort of more from the research side. So Renee, do you want to start? Something you've stopped doing?
Actually, rather than things that we stop doing, because it is actually very hard to stop doing stuff. It's easier to start doing stuff, but it's letting go of doing it all. There are some things you think we have to change this and we have to change that, and oh God, we have to change that too. You can't do it all. And so letting go of the idea that you will holistically be able to see change through to the end, and reprioritizing quite dramatically and saying, well, we're not going to get to that, or we're just not going to do that. Everybody else in the industry might be doing that. Everybody else might be on Snapchat or Peach or doing some kind of new technology thing, and you can't and you won't, and you'll have to explain to your newsroom why not, because everybody's going to come to you and say, well, why aren't we on this? My daughter says we should be doing this. And so it's actually letting go of the idea that you can achieve everything that looks good, and being quite ruthlessly, sometimes unpleasantly focused on, we're doing this one thing, and we're going to try to focus on doing this one thing well and figuring out how to do it well.
Inge?
Yeah, I can have two things. We've stopped doing Snapchat. We didn't feel like it was meeting the sort of objectives that we set out to do. So it wasn't meeting the sort of audience sort of goal we'd set ourselves, and it wasn't meeting the revenue goals we set ourselves, so we stopped doing that. And I think the other thing that we've stopped doing, are in the process of stopping doing, is trying to be some kind of a wire service. We have put a lot more emphasis on doing contextual journalism, doing better stories, and not do every single incremental news stories that people can find elsewhere on the internet.
That's very clear. Lucy, any thoughts from your interviews on how hard people find it to let go, and once who have let go successfully?
Firstly, just endorsing points being made, everyone said it's really easy to start things. And what's really evident also, there is so much concern in the industry, there's so many conferences, so many newsletters, it's very easy to get sucked into everyone is doing this, so we need to do it too. And that's where you need that kind of rigor of stopping, and do we, as Renee said, or do we really need to be doing this? Can we just park it for 6 months and see if it's really going to be important? And the other thing that really seems to be very important is to get track record in exiting things, so it becomes less toxic for the organization, because otherwise the alarm signals can really go off and the organization get kind of paralyzed. So you have to kind of set a precedent of letting things go. It has to become kind of part of knowledge in the system. There are some things we just stop doing, and stopping doing things is not something that really worries the organization. And one of the organizations I was involved with personally let go of a service that was a no-brainer, it needed to go. But stopping that was so incredibly painful. It was a big lesson, because everyone realized we think we can exit areas, but actually those exits are very time-consuming, very difficult, very painful, and take up huge amounts of energy. And I think that once you've done that, also it kind of brings the rigor in terms of deciding what new things you do. But it's kind of one of those issues that's neglected, but it kind of needs quite a lot of attention, I think.
Thank you. There was a question from the gentleman 2 or 3 rows from the back. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Matt Walsh. I'm from the University of Northampton in the UK. About 10 years or so ago, I was part of a team that was brought in at the Times in the UK to make some quite big changes to the website at the time. And Lucy, we would have really valued your report at the time. And I think that your 4 layers of different things that the organisations are doing really resonates with what we would have found at the time, actually. And I wonder, it seems to me that actually the change that's been in that 10 or more years has actually been quite small in some ways. And I wonder what you think we can do to make sure that we don't find ourselves in 10 years' time looking at a graphic that basically says the same thing. And we still haven't quite managed to get rid of those things that were the legacy parts of the organisation and move on to the new shiny things.
Well, I think in a way, sort of Inky brought this up. The problem is the legacy businesses are often keeping the lights on. It's just everyone knows at some point they're going to fall off a cliff. And that's really the kind of real challenge in terms of shifting the resources up, because the people at the bottom get quite pissed off. They say, listen, we are generating the revenues. How come we are being deprioritized? How come all the attention's going up there? And I think actually that's why learning, which sounds like such a dead word, is so incredibly important. I think if you can build in an organization that's very porous, that is constantly talking to peers, and you can develop a kind of broad sense within the organization of the challenges that are faced, then that shift becomes more normal and people understand things need to be deprioritized. Because what is very clear in organizations I spoke to is it's uneven the extent to which people really understand the kind of existential challenges this industry faces. And it's very difficult if you're one of the small group of people who do get it and the rest of the organization don't really understand why you're making such a fuss. So I think that's why these cultural learning issues are so absolutely fundamental. I think, you can't under-communicate enough. You can't...
Can't over-communicate.
Sorry, you can't over-communicate. A lot of leaders said to me, I can't believe I still need to be saying this, but clearly I do. But it's because actually people don't want to hear it because of some of the things Renee's saying. The implications are really quite unpleasant.
There's also an interesting aside from me. We had some pretty high-profile industry leader come through the Reuters Institute recently who made the point that that you can communicate, but there's also how communication is received, and whether the email from the top is the best way of doing it. And their observation to us was actually one of the things that my staff look at most closely is the speeches I make in foreign places. They're going and reading those, and there's a sense in which that cuts through. They sort of discount the kind of general skepticism of management emails when they see I've said it to an external audience, and then they kind of quote it back at me. So, interesting aside. Are there other questions, other people who want to ask questions at this stage? At the moment, yes. Lady at the back there, please.
Hi, my name is Steffi. I'm working with Funke Media Group. It's a big media organization in Germany. From what I've learned, your organizations are really into this transition and this transition to online, but I'd say that there are a lot of media organizations that are not that far. And on the same time, there are a lot of people trying to do this transition within the company. Would you say that there's a point at which you just have to give up and go somewhere else, or is persistence leading somewhere in the end if you don't have, like, maybe a company that is not doing this transition from top down? That's just that.
Who wants to take that? Well, I think it's...
So just one quick comment, and then if you have an answer. I don't have the answer to that, but I think that may slightly address Lucy's point about burnout, where when change doesn't work, or you feel like it's resistant, or you feel like people not only don't hear you but would like for you to go away, that can be discouraging. And I think you then try to rewrite the objective, or reframe the question, or basically find a new way to make it interesting for them to do the thing you want to do. And if it's not working in that organization, maybe it won't work at all, or maybe it won't work for you. But I think ultimately that probably is a personal decision.
No, I wish we had the answer to that one.
Yeah.
But it certainly takes a lot of resilience. But I don't think that many companies think that digital isn't the way to go. They're just finding different routes towards it. And if you think about it, Netflix is a digital thing. So the distribution of television is going to become digital at some point. So I think that you definitely need resilience, but I think you have to ask yourself all the time, what is the reward at the end of the day for you? And the reward at the end of the day for me, when I've pushed through every single barrier there is at CNN, and please don't get me wrong, there are definitely still barriers. The reward at the end of the day is that I'm getting out meaningful content that is being seen by hundreds of thousands of people that can change things. So you have to ask yourself, is the effort that you're putting in worth the reward you're getting? If there's an imbalance there, then you probably want to be looking at other parts of the business.
Thank you. Other questions, other things that people want to raise? If not, I'm going to be turning to the panelists and asking a question about how burnt out they are in a minute. So anybody want to save them from being asked whether they're burnt out yet or not? No, I'm afraid nobody's going to save you. So Lucy sort of, towards the end of her report, she had that quote that we put up at the end about digital storytelling and digital journalism are fun, but transforming organizations is a grind and often in the immediate term unrewarding. But she prefaced that by saying, disruption will not stop, rather it will gather pace. It was a slightly kind of Trotskyite view of a kind of permanent revolution in the news industry. And I just wanted to sort of put that together with the question of burnout. And just start by asking each of you about how much this resonates. And Renee, you've already dealt with it slightly, so I'll start with Inky first. But how do you kind of maintain the pace in a permanently changing world without either you getting burnt out or the people who are working in the company becoming cynical, disillusioned, or whatever? So
the nice, easy questions. Start with you, Inky.
I was going to say, wow, now I'm really hoping that somebody would have rescued me from this. So, you know, listen, I mean, burnout is, of course, an issue in our industry, and I don't think it's just with digital as such. But, I mean, it's a tricky one. I mean, first of all, we're in an industry where people are, on the whole, wanting to be in a very fast-pacing environment. Our content that we make on the whole has, 12, 24-hour shelf life at best. It's an expensive content for such a limited lifespan. You know, so we are all expecting to come in every day and have a new news stories. I mean, we would not want to do, although it's starting to feel a little bit like that with Trump's tweets, but, you know, we are all wanting new stories, new things to tackle every single day. So, you know, if we transfer that to the organizational kind of changes that need to happen, we are probably the individual who are the most able, the most agile, the most capable of holding out, you know, of having that sort of bullet train coming at us all the time. So I think that in terms of the personalities that go into this industry, we are actually quite well served. And I find that sort of pretty much every day. In terms of burnout, of course, it is hard. I mean, and it's in many ways. I mean, the news agenda has been relentless for 2 years. You definitely feel that in the newsrooms, that it's tiring. For the leaders, it's like, well, I have to keep on top of, you know, and for us at CNN, you know, what the hell were we criticized for in the last tweet? You know, where do we kind of respond to this? And then also thinking, well, where are we heading as an organization? How do I push digital even further? And then, I mean, my team is global, so I'm sort of thinking somewhere in the middle of this, I have to think about getting some sleep in. But you know, I am blessed with an amazing team, and I'm actually probably more worried about their burnout than my own. But, you know, I think that, you know, you have to take your time. You have to leave the office at a certain point. You have to think, you know what, you have to prioritize. And I have said this to the people that I work with. I said, decide what you're going to fail at this week. Because you're going to fail at something, and it's better for you to just having decided, I'm going to fail at this, and I'm going to focus on this. And then at least you feel like you've made a conscious decision about where you're going to go wrong.
Renee.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that failure is actually interesting because you learn something from it. And ultimately the goal is to learn stuff. It's, you know, the digital transition is complicated because people are always going to want to know, are we there yet? And we're not ever going to be there, actually. And that's the complicated thing, I think, actually about the world in general these days, but in particular journalism, since that's what we're here to talk about, is we're not quite sure what the future looks like. And in fact, the new form of journalism is probably one of understanding, actually, that we're constantly going to be updating and changing. So in that kind of economy where it's like, well, if we're never there, when, you know, that's wearisome or draining, I think that the solution or the challenge is staying very focused on specific projects, very focused on specific outcomes, having modest, realizable goals, and which can sort of feel a little bit discouraging when people are like, wait, I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to report great stories. The reason why I did this was because I felt like it was gratifying to you know, it can, you know, and so reminding people actually that it is still very much about the journalism, and that actually setting objectives, transforming and experimenting and measuring the success of these things actually gives you permission to do more of what you want to do. So maybe you want to do this cool new pop-up newsletter, or maybe you want to find a new way to cover tech by, you know, restructuring the way a certain desk works, or maybe you want to try some new live stream or live event. Setting clear projects and clear objectives actually gives you permission to do that, because if you're doing something because you think it's aligned with the objective and you fail, that's okay. You'll still be trying to realize a concrete goal. So actually, in a way, change and structured change gives you permission to try new stuff. At least that's what I tell people in the newsroom.
Okay. Well, I will have failed if we don't wrap up this session in about 3 minutes. So I'm going to turn to Lucy for a final thought from her perspective. And if either of you two want to give a final thought after that of 30 seconds, I will call on you. But Lucy, over to you.
Okay, thanks. I think two things. If I was boiling all of this down even further, it's firstly, be really rigorous in the thinking. There's huge complexity going on, and, you know, try and stand away from this furore and really focus on what you're trying to do. and be as porous as you can, get as much information as you can about the industry. There's a huge amount out there. So, but I think that last point Renee made about failure is really, really interesting. And there's been a lot of stuff about loving failure and failing fast. Failure is a horrible experience. None of us like failing. So I think it's very easy to be glib about it. But the Washington Post said something really interesting, which is that, you know, we'll try just about anything in a small way. We want to get enough data points. You know, so I think be very intentional about experiments and just try and capture the learning. So it's kind of reframing. It's really not about failing. It's about testing, getting another data point, you know, so you're smarter next time around.
Thank you, Lucy. Any last word, Inky or Renee? No? Yeah?
One very last word. It really is just about finding new ways to continue producing really great journalism. If people ask me what I do for a living, that's what I say.
Yeah, and in order to do that, you need good people. So I would say, you know, surround yourself with the good people. They don't always say yes to you, and you'll get there.
Okay, please join me in thanking Lucy, Renee, and Inky. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you both very much. Thanks all of you very much.
Thank you so much.
And well done on keeping us on time and on track.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.